So I've been lucky enough to shoot with Atlas anamorphic lenses across a wide range of projects, both commercially and narratively, for the last 5 to 6 years. I've shot with every iteration of Atlas lens, both the standard Orion series lenses and the Silver Edition lenses, and I've also shot with the 1.4 and the 1.6 extender and expanders. I wanted to put together this video in part to help answer a lot of questions I get quite frequently. A lot of people ask me if they had to buy one lens, which lens should they get? What are the differences between the 21 versus the 25 and how do they compare to the 32? And as good as a written response might be, I wanted to just share something visually and help provide at least enough information for people to make their own minds up, because when it comes to lenses, I believe it's a subjective category, it's a subjective decision that you have to make. There's no right lens for any right shot or job. There's a lot of sort of your own voice in it, as cliche as that might sound. No one can ever say that there's one right lens for one type of shot, and to me it just doesn't work that way. A lot of the cinematographers we all look up to and would sort of reference for how nice their work is, in part that work is the way it is because they've found their own voice with how they like to shoot a frame, with how they like to cover a room, or just how they like to tell a story. So with that in mind, the intention for this is just to share some information, show how certain things were approached, and hopefully that information will be useful to you when you're making your own choices. Whilst I've collaborated with Atlas over the last 5 to 6 years, this video and the contents of it is my opinion and perspectives on working with the lenses, and of course does not reflect any official point of view from Atlas as a company. And with it being my own opinion, Atlas is not conditioning this content or shaping it anyway. Before we touch on some of the more frequent questions that I mentioned earlier, I want to touch on something that comes up from time to time, and that's the relationship between the 239 and 240 aspect ratios and anamorphic. The term anamorphic is used to describe an optical process that's happening with a lens. Whilst 239 and 240 are the classic aspect ratios that you would get when you shoot anamorphic, you can also achieve those aspect ratios without having to use anamorphic lenses at all. The images you're seeing on screen right now from films I'm sure you recognize are all 239 or 240 images, but shot spherically with a 240 extraction. So if you feel the 239, 240, the wider aspect ratios are something you want to do for a project you have, I guess to point out the obvious, you don't have to shoot anamorphic in order to achieve them. It's there as an option, but it's not your only option. Probably the question I get asked the most is if I could buy one Atlas lens, which lens should I buy? And my thoughts and responses to it are probably quite annoying for a lot of people because, in my opinion, there's no fundamental or technical right answer to this question. There's a really insightful moment in an interview with Bruno Debonel, and he talks about reading a script and seeing day or night. He mentions that day could be quite dark and night could be quite bright. It all depends on how the director or how the cinematographer sees that scene coming together. So he's obviously touching on the subjectivity and interpretation that happen when you tell a story. I think it's the same with lenses. The images you've been looking at for the last few moments were shot between the 65 and the 100, in part because those were the only two lenses available at the time of filming, but it serves as a purpose to show that just between two lenses you can still achieve quite a lot of shot diversity. Can you shoot a whole film on one lens? Yeah, most definitely. Plenty of people have done it. But what lens to use for that, that is up to you. For me personally, which is of course all I have to go on, I do find myself shooting a lot of 50, 65 and 80, the sort of middle focal lengths that Atlas have. It would be subjective to explain, so I'm not going to try, but those three lenses are just the ones I've gravitated towards and seem to align with my sensibilities of how I like to shoot. I've had a lot of people reach out to me regarding the 1.6 extender and the new 1.4 expander. At a high level, what both of these allow you to do is to take an Atlas lens, which is engineered for Super 35, and adjust its image circle to cover larger format cameras. And they of course have application if you're shooting Super 35 by just increasing the focal length of the lens you're shooting on. The 1.4 and the 1.6 denote how much multiplication of the lens's focal length you're going to get. And in reference to my earlier comments when it comes to which one you should use on what lens, it's going to be down to you again with what focal length you think is right for the shot you're trying to achieve. The images you've been seeing are an example of something I've been exploring recently. using the 1.4 and the 1.6 with the newer 21 and 25mm focal lengths. On Super 35, the 25mm lens becomes a 35mm with the 1.4 and becomes a 40mm lens with the 1.6. If you have a camera that can shoot full frame and Super 35, then of course you're into another territory with being able to access other focal lengths. The 21 and the 25mm and how they compare to the other wider focal lengths such as the 32 and the 40 that Atlas have, this comes up a lot. However, unfortunately, my response to it's going to be annoying again, because there's no right answer in terms of which is the right wide lens to use for a project. The 21mm Atlas lens is quite a feat of engineering, and no one's done a 21mm before. You're into some very wide territory there, and I'm not sure if you'd ever need to go wider than that. As we all know from even spherical lenses that are very, very wide, when you're bending the light to that degree, you're going to introduce some distortion. The 25mm lens, whilst not as wide as a 21 obviously, is still a wide anamorphic lens, and those 4 extra millimeters of less width that you have mean less distortion. The less width means that the lens is distorting the light less, and distortion isn't a bad thing, it's a stylized look, so it's just different. Films like obviously The Revenant and The Favourite use extremely wide lenses to tell their story and embrace the distortion and everything that you need to embrace in order to shoot that wide and create that sort of world. Now I know I'm throwing a lot of subjectivity and telling you to keep things open to interpretation and basically telling you that there's no right answer. Again, as annoying as that can be, I think it's much more interesting to create from a place where you really can follow your gut and be a lot more free in your choices than just adhering to a set of rules or just doing what someone else tells you to do. This subjectivity is not isolated to just lens choice. There are so many creative choices that a cinematographer has to be prepared to make. And it's not just isolated even just to cinematography. Every head of department and every person on set is always making these creative choices to help bring a story to life. But I will leave this with much more of a defined answer to the last question. Are Atlas lenses soft?